Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is a scholar of religions who writes and lectures on religion, politics, and mysticism. Although rooted in the Christian tradition, he has immersed himself in learning other traditions, such as Hinduism and Islam. After his studies in philosophy, anthropology, and theology at different universities, he became active in various forms of local and international peace work, often with a focus on cultural and religious diversity. He currently teaches classics on ethics and spirituality at the KDG University of Applied Sciences and Arts. He's also the author of several books, including Halal Monk, Revision in Sufism, and most recently, Religion, Reality Behind the Myths. Jonas Atlas, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Hi, Artem.
Yeah, it's good to have you. So I want to set a little bit of context before we begin. And mind you, I'll be using the word religious and secular right now in the way that they're understood by most of society. But later we will explore how these concepts are perhaps a false dichotomy. So I grew up in a kind of secular, scientific, rationalistic household. Even though I have Jewish roots and my family from time to time celebrated some of the holidays, I wouldn't say they were in the very least religious. And I think both of my parents would identify as atheists till this day. I also considered myself an atheist until I had a series of mystical experiences that made that belief completely untenable. And I think for a while I identified with the spiritual but not religious camp, until I really started to look deeper into religion. And I learned a decent amount about mythology, symbols, and archetypes, and came to recognize that whatever religion was, it was much deeper and more pervasive than I ever thought before. So here we are now, and I'm speaking to you, and I'd love to dive into the 7 myths of religion that you write about in your latest book, as well as your own definition and understanding of religion. But first, I'm really curious to hear about your background, your upbringing, and maybe some of the pivotal events that guided you towards studying religion.
Yeah. I grew up, I'd say, normal Belgian kid, which means a bit like your own background, I guess. Not being Jewish, but Christian, of course. The whole of Belgium used to be dominantly Catholic, so I've got a Catholic background, but that doesn't imply too much. I went to church sometimes. My mom, however, was a bit more religious than your parents. So I remember her sitting on her bed praying. For example, just every night she would do a little prayer of, let's say, 10 minutes or something. And I think that's probably one of the first pivotal things. That's to say that for me, religion never was something oppressive or something I had to or whatever. It was something of a distant past, seemingly, at first, because Belgium has been, as they say, or as they call it, secularized for quite a while now. Yes, it has this Catholic background, but that's something in history for most people. But most people still have a bit of an aversion to religion in general and don't consider themselves to be very church-going people and so on. So it's more of a minority, really, the real church-going Catholics of today. But my mom was one of them, and I've never felt it to be a problematic stance in life or way of dealing or living or being generally in society. And so that's what I mean. It's a pivotal thing because it contrasted my own experience as a kid with the general tone around religion in the society in which I grew up. That doesn't mean I was religious immediately. That only happened when I was 16. It wasn't a full-on mystical experience. I wouldn't call it that way, but I got interested into meditation and so on. That went a bit through going to acupuncturist, and he gave those meditation classes and so on, and that interested me. and got me on that spiritual path, let's say. And it did lead to certain experiences. But above all, for some, I don't remember too well, but somewhere in high school, I started researching the sociological side of religion. It just interested me. Some people like cars, other people like mechanics. I like religion in a general sociological, anthropological sense. Which religions are there? How do they deal with life? What are the various thoughts in several religions and the various forms of thinking about the world and the universe? And so it just interests me. And so that led me, not immediately, I first did physiotherapy and then philosophy. And then eventually I wound up in religious studies in university. And so I'd consider myself a theologian or religious scholar as well, if I have to take one of those academic backgrounds as my main background. And from that interest, it just went on from there. But of course, there's this double side, which is never explicitly detached. And there are links there, but it's necessary to be clear about one thing is my interest in religion as such, which is a research interest, and the other thing is I'm a person with a spiritual background as well, in the sense that, like many other people, I'm walking a spiritual path where I try to find the truth in life and try to come closer to God, let's say. And that's a personal thing, of course. And obviously those two are linked, but it's not necessarily always the same thing. And so then also important when asking about pivotal moments, I used to have a big interest in the more Eastern religions, let's say, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on. Even more so, like many people of my day and age, I first was interested in Hinduism and Buddhism, and then I rediscovered Christianity. That's to say that the ideas that I got from Hinduism and Buddhism kind of opened me up to a new understanding of my own Christian background. And it made me read, for example, the Gospels in a totally new way. The things that Christ was saying suddenly made sense in a completely different manner than I thought I had been brought up in. And so that opened as well. And then the third thing was very important. I moved to Turkey when I was 26 or something. I was married to somebody from Turkey, to a Muslim woman, therefore. And so we were married for 5 years. But in those 5 years, I got really acquainted with Islam. From the research perspective, I delved into certain texts and books and so on, but simply from a life perspective, I just, it was my surroundings, Muslims and Islam itself. And so it opened me up to the beauty and the immensity of that tradition as well, which means that time, it was 2006, 2007, so that's about 5 years after 9/11. So the whole world was getting stuck in this Islamophobic mentality where it was the West versus Islam and so on. And living in Turkey, reading the newspapers from Belgium and the BBC and from America, I was getting this feeling like, okay, they talk about Muslims all the time, but this has absolutely no relationship with all the people I see around me in the street. So what the hell is happening there? And so that also got me into this deeper interest in the image creation around specifically Islam, but in a broader sense, religion in general. Why are people construing it that way? And what kind of us versus them mentality do we create when we do so?
Yeah, so I think you're already kind of speaking to the next question I kind of wanted to ask. Why do you feel that people misunderstanding religion is a problem? It does seem like you having this experience of living in Turkey not too long after 9/11 and kind of seeing the disparity. And often we'll see, I'll hear a lot of stuff about people seeing something in other countries on the news and like, this is how it is in this country, or this country is terrible, or this is what these people are doing, without actually being there. They're just kind of hearing something through another party. And then it does also seem like there's this aspect of polarization that you're also mentioning, us versus them. So maybe you can speak a little bit more to like the major problem that you're kind of getting at here with this book and with a lot of your work.
Yeah, one of the major problems is that the word religion tends to be understood as some sort of universal concept and has always been there, and which is obvious that it's there, and as such as a kind of neutral concept. And as if we can simply look at the world and see those religions and then start making a list of what belongs to them and what doesn't belong to them. And that kind of feels intuitively normal and right to most people, while it isn't. And it isn't because of a couple of reasons. First of all, you can't just make a list of things that then kind of is the perfect example of what that religion would be or should be, because there's too many varieties of religions, of a particular religion in any case, but we'll get to that later, I guess. But the other aspect is it's not neutral in the sense that religion always has had this political element to it. The way we construe the world in religions has always had a particular historic background, which means that the political power plays at play at those times always feed into the way we look at religion. And not to get too historically difficult immediately, let's stick to the example of Islam, and the way people started perceiving Islam is exactly what you said, that people had this feeling that they knew what Islam was, even though they have never been there. Even more so, sometimes if you want to go to a certain country, you can't even bring the knowledge of that country to another country. Let me give you a very concrete example. I went to Iran for a holiday one day, just as a tourist, and checking out things, and of course learning more about that particular form of Islam. And then a couple of months later, I wanted to go to the US, actually to interview Hossein Nasr, who has also Iranian roots and is a very important scholar in the US of Islam. But all of a sudden, I figured out I couldn't get a visa to the US because I had been to Iran. And that's a perfect example of you can't even bring the knowledge that you took there and bring it to another place sometimes, because they politically create boundaries that make it difficult to start to get to know the other side. But that's really concretely politically. But the boundary is often very mental, and specifically when it comes to Islam, the boundary is also that people simply think that they know what religion is, and religion by definition is institutionalized and dogmatic and problematic and creates all these kinds of violence. Just look at those terrorists, for example. And then what they do is collapse the whole of Islam into a couple of terrorists, which obviously are there and they do exist and it's a group, but nobody takes the time to even check, are they marginal? Are they the dominant force? What is Islam really about? Is this a particular thing in this point of time, or has it historically always been there, or whatever? What is the complexity of a religion? People don't even have the feeling they have to research it, because the concept of religion makes it so obvious that it is dogmatic, that it will lead to violence if you leave the dogmatic ideas go rampant in society and so on. So that's a bit what I mean. The way we look at religion in general, but certainly at specific religious groups such as Muslims, is always informed by particular historical moments and the politics that go together with them.
Yeah, thanks for unpacking that. And like, I'm really struck by the whole thing of you going to Iran and not being able to come to the United States, and there being these deep like psychological barriers and prejudices that we have, and stories and ideas and narratives. And it's like very it's very black. It becomes like very black or white, right? Mm-hmm. It becomes like these very black or white conceptual things. And then also, with we like to focus on the really negative things, right? So if there is a terrorist or that somebody commits that kind of act, then it's like everybody's like that. And you see that in the United States because you're where are you located right now? You're in Europe,
I'm in
right?
Belgium, yeah.
You're in Belgium, yeah. So polarization is all over the place, but in the United States, the political parties and the culture here, the culture wars, there's a lot of polarization, especially here. And this is what people do. It's like they'll say, well, look at those liberals or look at those conservatives. And they'll find people that are very extreme, have very extreme viewpoints, and they'll group everybody into that slot. And that it just seems like that's how the mind it's drawn to, like these very extreme examples and outliers and cases. And it's just easy to then make everything black or white very neatly and just give us certainty, and avoiding this kind of gray, nuanced area that kind of exists in all of experience and all of reality.
Yeah. And that's, of course, because we can't live without categories either. We always have to make categories to kind of get a hold of life itself and to know what we have to do. Oh, I meet somebody like this. Probably I'll have to reply like this, or I have to talk like this. Half of the time, those categories really are useful. But sometimes when those categories get really rusted and too general and too generalized, then they become really problematic. Yeah? And that's half of the problem of religion itself. It is a category which often has outgrown its use, if it ever had a use. And people, again, coming back to the neutrality point, that people think it's a neutral term, and it isn't. The way it is used always is embedded within a specific power play. And so, yeah, it's a bit the same like the political polarization right now in the US. Yeah, indeed. Which often also has this undertone in the US more than here in Belgium. We've got the same tendency between the left and the right, of course, but less in terms of religion, like you have in the United States, how the evangelical side is linked to the Republican side, and how people often in the US, when they use the term spiritual but not religion or not religious, are also partly specifically making clear that they're not like evangelical Christians that are on the Republican side. And that, of course, for me as a Belgian Christian is a bit weird, because I'm a pretty progressive leftist guy myself when it comes to politics, but I have no relationship at all with evangelical Christians in most of what they think. But I am a Christian nonetheless, and that in itself goes to show the diversity of religion. We're a couple of thousand kilometers apart, and the way I live my Christianity has very little to do with what evangelical Christians do or think most of the days, or mostly. But that doesn't mean they're not Christian. I might have my differences, and I think they're not following the real teachings of Christ, and I'll make my theological point about it, why I think so. But I'm not able to say, certainly not in a sociological sense, that they wouldn't be Christian. And the exact same thing, of course, is the same for Muslims. And you've got that probably exists in the US as well. In Belgium, we had a couple of times when there's some terrorist attack somewhere in the world that people start asking of Muslims that they have to go and say sorry for it, kind of. They have to make this public confession that they are not like them. And that, for me, has always struck me as so bizarre, why people would think that somebody who has nothing to do with some terrorist who does something simply because there's a link of Islam there, that's exactly the same as me in Belgium having to say sorry for somebody who bombed an abortion clinic in the US or something. But when it comes to Christians in Belgium, people won't make that categorical mistake. But when it comes to Muslim, they do it all the time. Oh, you're part of them, and them means you're all like that unless you constantly say you're not. Makes it a bizarre kind of polarization indeed.
Yeah, this is and it's interesting because polarization is something that I've been really interested in and exploring a lot. And now seeing it through this angle of religion, the way you present it, like I didn't think of it in such a deep level. And, I think maybe now would be kind of a good time to kind of list the 7 myths that people believe about religion. and then we could maybe start kind of diving into some of them. We probably won't have time to talk about all of them, but we'll just kind of, bounce around. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So the seven myths, those seven myths are, first of all, maybe it's not like I distilled them from long research and so on. The way I started the book, it's very backed up by academic research. That's not a problem. But the myths in themselves are mostly the ones that I was confronted with when I was speaking to people about religion, which I have been doing since I was 16, as I explained. Because I lived in a heavily secularized country, I always had the feeling I had to defend myself for being religious. I had to explain why somebody who seemed intelligent could still choose to be religious, something like that. And so I kind of listed the seven most common arguments or the seven most common problems that I would be confronted with when talking in a pub, or I don't know, in a debate or something, or in school when I'm teaching my students or something. And so those seven myths are, and I think most people will recognize them. One, religion is based on faith. That is the first one. It's built on deeply ingrained ideas that you have to believe if you follow that tradition. And because you believe certain things, you'll also have a certain lifestyle or particular rules that you'll follow. If you believe in God, God wants you to do this or live this way, so you'll do it. Then the second myth is that those aspects of faith and regulations of life are mainly determined by a sort of class of priests, depending on the religion. They might be called differently, but there's this elite that determines what the real contents of the faith are. Then the third myth, according to me, is that religions are very clearly distinguished from each other. There you've got the Jews, and they're completely different from the Buddhists, and that's Hindu, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the Christian and so on, because, of course, they are supposedly completely defined by their faith and their regulations. So if they differ in those, then they differ from each other. Then the fourth myth is that what we already talked about, lots of people have the feeling that they are spiritual but not religious. And that sentence itself kind of goes to show that most people nowadays have the feeling that there's a separation between the two. You've got spirituality on the one side, that's personal, you do your thing, and you're free. And on the other side, you've got religion, which is institutionalized, which is more dogmatic and actually often limits your personal spirituality more than it frees it up. And then the fifth myth is the idea, if religion is first and foremost based on faith, it's kind of irrational. It's something you believe. But on the other side of the spectrum, you've got science, and science that's all about rationality. That's about the facts and not about faith. And so science and religion, they inevitably will clash with one another, as they have always done all through history. And then the seventh myth is that because of the first six, actually, because science is more factual and less the sixth myth, I'm forgetting one. The sixth myth is that religion, because they are so stubborn in their dogmatic ideas, will, unless they're contained somehow, if you don't contain them, then they will become very violent. And so most of the violence in the world is attributable to religion. And so the seventh myth follows from those first six, that a secular society, which is less determined by religion and less determined by dogmatic faith, which is non-scientific, such a society will inevitably be far better than a religious society. And there's also a clear difference that the way of living in a secular society is completely different than a religious society. And that's also, and so the secular way of life is something that we should have to kind of contain that religion so that it doesn't become too violent. So that's all seven of them.
Yeah. And maybe we can start addressing the first myth, because I do think in many ways this idea that religion is a set of dogmatic beliefs is perhaps the most pervasive of all the myths you speak about. At least for me, like that's when people say, "Oh, I'm not religious," like that's what they, it seems like that's what they mean. It's like, oh no, I don't follow strict laws. Like I have my spiritual path, which is unique, and I kind of experience things.
Yeah.
And so are most religions not dogmatic? And if not, why do you think so many people believe religions are in fact dogmatic?
Most religions definitely aren't, because most religions are orthopraxic, as they call it in academic circles. So there's a difference between orthodoxies and orthopraxis, and orthodoxies is following a faith in which having the right conviction is really important, or the most important thing. And orthopraxis is more about doing the things that you're supposed to do because the ancestors already did it and we all do it, and that's tradition, and that's why we uphold it. In fact, the Roman religion was more like that than an orthopraxis. Hinduism today is more like that. You can point towards various examples, so I wouldn't statistically put my hand in the fire for it, but a large chunk of religion is more orthopraxical than it is orthodoxical. So that's the first part, and doing things is often more important, and the way you really think about things is not really necessarily what people care about. But even if you look at the orthopraxis, then the fact of the matter is that most religions are really difficult to delineate within certain specific convictions. There's way too much variety. Probably the most extreme example is one that I also mentioned in the book, is the way we look at Buddhism and how it supposedly is, or many people have this discussion whether Buddhism really is a religion or not. And when they have that discussion, it's mostly because, well, Buddha didn't talk about gods and Buddhism doesn't have any gods, so it's an atheistic lifestyle more because it doesn't have a god ID. It's not a real religion. Yeah, well, certain strands of Buddhism, certainly in the West, seem to be atheistic, and sometimes in Asia you can also come across certain forms of atheistic Buddhism. That's certainly true. But just go to Tibet, just go to Nepal, just go to Thailand, and you'll be encountering lots and lots of demons and gods and angels and hells filled with those demons and devils and various types of gods that the people really worship, or at least go to a statue and then put incense in front of it and put flowers there, and so on and so on. So that goes to show that even within that one particular religion, you've got atheists on the one hand and very in God believing people on the other hand as well. So that's one example. But even if you look at the religion that most people think of when we think of a creedal religion, that obviously is Christianity. And that's why this whole discussion about spiritual and not religious is really stemming from that particular Christian region, let's say, that's to say America and Europe for the most part. And so from that region, people have this historic idea that religion is basically premised on faith, because certainly in a Protestant context of the US, or let's say it's not necessarily only Protestant, but let's say that Protestant Christianity put a rather large stamp on the culture of the US. And so from that culture, then it becomes normal to react against what you see to be one of the main aspects of Christianity, which is an emphasis on faith. And I can't really deny that. I won't ever deny it. Within the history of Christianity, that has always been a big part. But that being said, if you simply look at history, if I'd want to really lump together Christianity in very specific convictions, that becomes very difficult, except maybe there was this guy Christ. He was really important because he had some good ideas and he had some connection with the divine. And I say some connection with the divine because a lot of Christians will probably say, but he's the Son of God. Yeah, sure. Except that I grew up in Christian communities where that whole terminology of the Son of God really doesn't sit well with most people that would consider themselves Christian. Yes, they go to church. Yes, they believe in God, but the Son of God, oh well, but it's metaphorically, and I see him more as a guru type figure or a teacher of his days, and he still inspires me today. That kind of stuff is pretty normal for a guy like me in Belgium, and what the Christian community entails here. That, of course, is really far away from, again, evangelical Christians in the US, certainly so. And so I won't deny that certain segments of the Christian evangelical right in the US are very dogmatic in certain stances. Yeah, that's right. But why would they be more of a representative form of Christianity than I would be? That's the thing I can't get my head around. That one I simply don't believe. And so even if you look in history, I can just give another example from Christianity, which is one of my favorite examples. Trinity, which seems to be one of the most foundational parts of Christianity. God, the Father, and the Spirit are one. I actually believe it in my theological considerations about Christianity. But if I'd go to a church here and I just put a microphone on their people and I ask them, can you explain Trinity to me? You'll get nothing but bumbling, because they really don't know how to answer such a thing, really haven't thought too hard and deep about it. And so, yeah, probably in the Middle Ages, that was a very important creedal aspect of the Christian elite, let's say. But even in the time of the apostles, that's to say the followers of Christ, they didn't have a concept like Trinity. That only arises 100 years later or something. Or it really stabilizes 100 years later. So that goes to show, is a Christian somebody who certainly believes in Trinity? Then, yeah, well, what do you do with the followers of Christ himself? And I could go on and on. And that's even within a tradition where the importance of creed is very large. And so that says nothing about the religions where that importance is a lot less.
Yeah, and it makes me part of what you said makes me touch back on the point that our understanding, the version of Christianity that becomes representative is the one that's most extreme. It's the one that's most dogmatic. So that's what people won't take your kind of Christianity as that's what Christianity is. They'll take it from somebody that's more the dogmatic, or somebody that literally believes the stuff, somebody that's like, yeah, actually Jesus was literally the Son of God, not like we're all the Son of God. No, he was the Son of God.
Yeah.
And then you wrote another point that I think is also important to mention. And you wrote, we can find plenty of people in various traditions who do take their sacred scriptures literally. They read each story as factual and try to apply each precept as strictly as possible. However, even they can never do so with complete consistency. Some passages are contradictory or paradoxical, requiring them to let one take precedence over the other. Even literalists are constantly making choices concerning which rules to follow. So what you're saying here is that it's impossible to be perfectly dogmatic. There's always the element of interpretation when interacting with religious teachings.
Yeah. By definition, it really is impossible. There's a cute YouTube somewhere. People can look it up. It's a guy who it's a journalist, and every year he does something bizarre. And one year he tried to live biblically, as he said, and he gives a whole lecture about his year of living biblically. The first thing he did was writing down all the supposed commandments which were in the Bible and then trying to follow them. But there were so many, and some of them contradictory, that it really was impossible. You have to pick and choose. That was kind of his argument there. But that goes for the full spectrum of stories and commandments and all you want in Scripture. And again, we're talking about specifically religions where scriptures are really important. That's not always the case. And to come back to your point of people who say, well, I find religion problematic because then you have to believe things. That's half of the time really what they meant. There's an old book, and in the old book, it says what you have to believe. Yeah, well, no, that old book, it says a lot of things, and people have always been discussing how to deal with it. And so, yes, the literalists have become the norm, supposedly, because everybody thinks that is what religion is. But if you simply look at the history, it makes no sense at all. Even in the 3rd century, people like Origenes, or in the 5th century, people like St. Augustine, not the least of the theologians in Christianity, even they themselves said that for example, Genesis and the way the earth was construed, that you have to take it metaphorically. Obviously, you have to. Lots of passages in the Bible are meant to be read symbolically and metaphorically. They knew it in the 3rd, 5th, and 5th century. It's not something new or modern. That has most of the time been the normal way of approaching the Bible. In the Middle Ages, it became so symbolic that some people started to sometimes have this counter narrative to go away from too much symbolizing, where you also can, because that's another problem that can arise. If you go too symbolic, then you really start seeing symbols everywhere which don't immediately have anything to do with the real concrete text which is there. Then you just go flying in your spiritual mind, but you don't stick to what Jesus really actually said and what he meant in his day and age and so on. So that's not to say that symbolism is the complete solution or so on, or anything like that. Both sides have always existed. Yes, there were some people who tried to take things literally, but the more serious theologians always have kind of discarded it. But nowadays, people think that those literal dogmatic ones are the ones that were the norm in history, and therefore are the best example of any religion, actually. And so there's a problem there when it comes to when it specifically comes to scripture as well. Reading it, there's 2 arguments there. First of all, in history, nobody has taken it literally. Most sensible theologians found that a problematic way of approaching a specific scripture. And the other side is what you mentioned, that even if you try to take it literally, you'll wind up having to interpret things, because not everything is said there. Sometimes there are contradictions, and so on and so on. So yeah,
there's a lot to be said about literalism, and maybe we could towards the end circle around to that, because I feel like a lot of the issue is more so with literalism and fundamentalism than religions. But right now, I'd kind of like to talk about transcendence and God. And I'm not sure exactly where you speak about these things, but you write, religions are not necessarily determined by belief in one or more gods. On top of it, when we do encounter conceptualizations of the divine in different religions, these can encompass varying and not always comparable perceptions of divine manifestation. And I do agree that the way we conceptualize God, varies from person to person. But it does seem to me that most religions do, in fact, deal with transcendence or a concept of God, something bigger than ourselves. So despite minority interpretations of religion, would you say that not at the very least, the Abrahamic religions are, in fact, there is this kind of thread of, moving towards God, transcendence, or salvation?
Sure. There's a dominant strain there. Yeah. And not only in Abrahamic religions, I think all over the world, there's a dominant tendency to find out the transcendent truth of the cosmos. But that seems only a very human urge to me. That's also eventually, I see every type of, let's say, story building of life itself is religious for me. And so that includes everything that is called secular today. But we'll probably get back to that. But so, yeah, transcendence is always something that has been pursued by people, sometimes because they experienced it. They had this overwhelming experience of something bigger than themselves, and they felt connected to it, and then they wanted to give words to it or rituals even to it, and so on. But on the other side, I replied to that by also saying, yeah, sure, it's a dominant strain in religions, but it's a dominant strain in humanity. And you can also see it in those elements of society that we normally wouldn't consider religious. And I guess that the invisible hand of the market is a very good example here, how even in economics, all of a sudden there arises this transcendental idea of the invisible hand of the market. And then some economists will say, oh, but that's just a metaphor. We don't really mean something transcendent. Yeah, well, try to explain that to most politicians in the neoliberal society or in neoliberal parties. They are really convinced that there is this thing that guides society in a good way as long as you leave the economy to itself, because there's this transcendent force that just brings it about. And if that's not a good example, probably nationalism is an even better example, or at least the idea of a people and a nation, as if one group of people, because they happen to be born in a certain place, are somehow mysteriously connected to this overarching concept of a people where you belong to, while it's just determined by a couple of borders in the ground, which were not naturally there. They have been drawn and redrawn and redrawn and redrawn on certain papers, but people feel connected to them as if it's something larger than themselves. So, yeah, sure, in religion, dominantly speaking, atheism is not the norm, no. But that goes for the whole of humanity, even outside of those groups that we would normally define as religious.
Yeah, that makes me think of transhumanists, and even transhumanists, and it's like they hold a secular view, and it's like, oh, we're gonna download your consciousness onto a computer, and you'll
perfect
exist
example.
forever.
Yeah, can't get more religious than that. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, but that also makes it interesting, and probably one of the things that I mostly try to get at often is that talking about religion and the categorization, those religions there and those, and that's a good religion and that's a bad religion, that focuses our attention on the container and not on the content. And that is, for me, one of the problems. So part of what I try to do is deconstruct the whole concept of religion so that we can finally really have the discussions that are worth having. And those are about the transcendent reality. Is it there? If it is there, what does it look like? What does it imply for my life? And those are really interesting conversations. But if we get stuck in, Muslims are bad because of, look in the Quran, this and this and this, then we forget to simply have a conversation about what did that tradition for the last 1400 years have to say about the transcendent? Does it make any sense to me? And what does my tradition say? And is it interesting to have that conversation? And of course it's interesting. But the thing is, we get stuck by focusing on the outer husk of the thing and not on the kernel, which is inside.
Yeah. I'd like to move towards talking about religion and spirituality. And this is myth 4. Spirituality and mysticism contrast with religion. Spirituality is perceived as beautiful and liberating, while religion is seen as limiting. This results in a large group of people stating they are spiritual, but not religious. So is there not a difference between spirituality and religion?
Nah, for me, there can't be any difference in the end. And the argument is kind of twofold. On the one hand, one of the problems is that when people say such a thing, then the claim is that there is this religious dogmatic thing without any spirituality, and that's a problematic one. All traditions are filled to the brim with spiritual aspects within that religion. And on the other side, those people who claim to be spiritual but not religious, if you look at what they do really, they do the stuff that in any other context would be considered religious. And so for me, that's the same thing again. You try to create this idea as if there's a problematic whole of ideas and concepts and ways of living of life which are problematic, we'll call them religious. Those on one side, and then being spiritual is fine. And whatever I do is fine because I'm spiritual. And as long as I'm not religious, it's okay. But that is blinding people to the problems that certainly also do exist within spiritual but not religious context. The most obvious example would be gurus who abuse their power over their students and so on. There's plenty of examples, from enriching themselves to sexual abuse and so on. But people sometimes have the tendency to think, oh, I'm doing the spiritual thing and my guru is so spiritual and he's not dogmatic, that they blind themselves to power plays that in a religious context you'd be very aware of. And so we have to talk about the power dynamics, and not being spiritual but not religious doesn't make you free from power dynamics. And power dynamics are the real discussion in certain or in particular moments. And distinguishing religion from spirituality won't help us by acting as if only religions have a problem with power relationships and power dynamics. That's simply not true. We all have a problem with power dynamics. We're constantly confronted with them. That's one. And if you get blinded to such a thing, you also get blinded to, even though religious traditions have done many faulty, problematic, sometimes heavily violent stuff throughout history, nonetheless, because they have been going on for such a long time, there's this kind of ingrained balance within religious traditions as well. So many wise people have followed generation after generation after generation, that they have found, if you look for the right people, if you look for the right text, if you look for the right guidance, you can see how they balance the stuff and how they know that power relationships and power dynamics can move to one side or to the other side. As, for example, to give just one example, the example I just gave, taking things literally, completely, only in a spiritual text, yeah, well, that's problematic. But going so symbolically that you lose every kind of anchorage, that's probably also not it. So the balance is somewhere in between there. And that goes for most stuff in life and most stuff in religion. So that's also one of the reasons why I think the spiritual but not religious needs to be retaught sometimes, because it moves over to the side all kinds of stuff. It throws away the child with the bathwater, so to speak. And so, yeah, in my view on religion itself is the whole of traditions and stories and ways of life and community and all you want, although the stuff that we associate with religion, certainly it's there. But inside of any religious tradition is also a bunch of spirituality giving fire to the whole thing. And you can't have the fire without really having the flames. That's the thing. And so within religious traditions, you'll always find that fire if you only want to look a little bit further. And on the other hand, if you have a fire, you'll have flames as well. And just be honest about them and see what kind of tradition that is creating. There is no such thing as a spirituality that is free floating and that only remains inner. As long as we're human, in a body, in the world, we'll have an outer aspect to ourselves as well. And that goes together with talking to people and having a community, or even distancing ourselves from a community. But that in itself is also a way of presenting yourself distanced from someone else.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to with this false dichotomy between spirituality and religion, in some way we can say that about a lot of things. Like there's a lot of false dichotomies, and in non-dual teachings, that's what they essentially say, is that this dualistic notion, this dualistic experience that we have is ultimately not true, and that there's a different way of seeing it. And it seems like with language, we can't help, right? We can't help but for language to be dualistic. So we come up with these categories and terms, but a lot of times they're very rigid, or they're very polarizing, and they don't have that kind of nuance. And actually, I mean, there's a lot, like, one of the things you say about, the kind of conclusion of your book is, you write, is our conceptualization of religion seems to be at odds with the reality of religion. What we think about religion does not correspond to what religion truly is. This is the inevitable conclusion of this book. But it's interesting to me that your book was not just really about religion, because I think it really corresponds to who we are and what reality is. So that same statement could have been like, who we think we are and what we think reality is not is not really what it is. And then one more point I wanted to make, because we're talking about spirituality and religion. We do have these two concepts, right? And perhaps there is a false dichotomy. Perhaps it is really two sides of the same coin. And I wanted to kind of run this definition past you. And I think you did mention having kind of an interior and exterior part of experience. But I want to run this definition past you and see what you think. So according to philosopher Forrest Landry, spirituality is about how one perceives and experiences, how one accepts and integrates those perceptions and experiences into oneself. It is about how one integrates life's events, reflects upon them, and learns from them. Spirituality is a philosophy about the role that a world plays within oneself. Religion is about how one expresses with others for the common good, the greater social and natural environment in which one lives. It's about one's expressions and connections, choices, and how one integrates their choices into the community in which one lives. Religion is a philosophy about the role one plays in a world and about how that world accepts each self. Spirituality relates to the integration of a world into oneself. Religion relates to the integration of oneself into a world.
Yeah, I can follow the definitions you're giving here, but for me, what has been done there is a new definition of what the transcendentalist school, the traditionalist school as well. Sorry, not the transcendentalist, but the traditionalist school, the perennialists, like Fritjof Schuon and so on. What they would call the esoteric versus the exoteric. So the inside versus the outside, in Islamic terms, the zahir and the batin. And that definitely speaks to what I had just been saying. There's an inner side, there's an outer side. But for me, the two belong together in religion as such, because I cannot distinguish the two in my own religious life. That's to say, if I go and pray, I live in an old hermitage somewhere in the forest, and there's a chapel right here. So every morning and every evening, I'm in that chapel and I pray and I meditate. And I've got this, what people would probably call an eclectic form of prayer and meditation, where I created my own prayer dynamics or sequence of both physical and inner sayings and prayers. But half of the time it's also simply silence, what people would normally associate with Zen Buddhist-like meditation or something, stuff like that. I do as well, of course. But when I'm doing that, there is no necessarily only me reflecting on the world, me in my personal spiritual bubble or something. My prayer, even though it might seem very personal, which it half of the time is at the same time a very connected thing. Not at least connected to God and from God to the rest of the world, but it's also connected in tradition. I'm praying here as well, even if I don't feel like it. I'll pray here because that's what has been done over the centuries here. And I think that's important. My wife always says, silence, that is not something you can create. Silence that heaps itself up. That goes better in Flemish. That sounds weird in English, but it just, silence is something that is added organically to itself or something like that. And so that's what happens when I'm here and I'm doing the silence. I'm actually not doing anything, but at the same time, I'm heaping up. There's a larger amount of silence in this vicinity. And that's why in places like this and in monasteries and in other parts of the world where people have come together for centuries sharing prayer and meditation, you get this overwhelming, if you're a bit open to it, you can sense that silence just being there. That spiritual pureness kind of resonates a bit stronger in certain places in the world. And half of the time is because people connect to it and keep it going, while not really they themselves adding to it. And at the same time, they get from it or they don't. I don't know. There's this weird paradox where our language really blocks, where you go into more Advaitic and non-dualist ways of experiencing the world. And because I actually think that non-dualism is a very sensible path to tread, that's why I never would make that complete distinction between spirituality as the inner thing and religion as the outer thing. I kind of do it for spirituality and call it the inner because it is about the spirit, but religion itself is for me not only the outer. Religion is the complete thing. And I guess I would simply have to find another way to, I'd have to find another word for the outer that the person you just read the definition of, what he means there. If I find another word, I could say, okay, I can kind of go along with your idea of spirituality as the inner side. And let's take the exoteric is the other part. But religion for me is the non-dual overarching thing. It's neither this, neither that. It's both at the same time.
Yeah, thanks for also sharing your practice. And a hermitage, is that similar to a monastery? Well, I'm kind of curious.
Not also. Really. It's hermitages are so the places where hermits used to live, and the hermits are a bit of a strange group within the Christian history, because people tend to think that they live in the mountain with a long beard and a recluse and never see people of the world and are only dealing with prayer. That's sometimes those people have existed, but that's not the norm. The norm, at least certainly not here in these Western European countries, the norm of hermits was to live with 1, 2, or 3. Sometimes 1, sometimes 2. If somebody dies, then it takes a couple of years before somebody else arrives, and so on. But so small communities, and not necessarily of priests or ordained monks. So they don't have a specific rule. They do live together. Yes, they do have a part of a more spiritual, devoted life, but they have strong connections with society as well. So some of the hermits that used to live here were simply the teachers in the village nearby in history. And so hermits are those people who are often lay people, but who do have the feeling or then feel the need to balance action and contemplation a bit more, and who try to find a way of life that is constantly informed from the spiritual and mystical within to the without, but it's not like they're completely separated. So it's a bit of a specific line, and no two hermits are the same, so it's difficult to really draw a line into all of it. But yeah, it's there. And it's not like we don't call ourselves hermits. Me and my wife, we live together here, and we don't call ourselves that way because there's this romantic, and romantic in the sense of 19th century romanticism. That 19th century romanticism gave us all of those ideas of those recluses who were really strange in the mountains somewhere and so on. And people, if I would say I live like a hermit, they always go and think such things of me, which is not the case. I teach in a school and a university, and I live a pretty normal life. But on the other hand, I do find myself in the tradition of those people who were lay people, but who still tried to find the essence of life and started wondering, what if I try to live my life of action from the contemplation side? So what if the essence of life is really what is essential and not all of that other stuff that the world wants us to deal with, but eventually only wants us to do that to make some people rich?
Yeah, I'm curious if the history of the property is what attracted you, but I find it kind of like all like very ironic, like that you study religion, you're so much into it, and almost like, let me look at the history behind, like looking for a house, like, oh, actually the history, there was very religious people living here, so it fits my path.
Yeah, that wasn't completely it. I knew the guy who lived before us, who was here before us, so that was one thing. But what attracted us, I delved into the history of this particular place and hermits in general, because of my interest. But no, what attracted us here was arriving here, and it's a beautiful place. It's in a forest and so on. But it's not just the natural beauty that was certainly there, but it's more the thing that was describing before. There is some energy here. There is some vibrance here. There's something that resonates here that you simply feel. This goes that little bit beyond nature. This puts a stamp of holiness. I really don't have any other word for this. There's a stamp of holiness on this place, and that's what attracted us for a very large part. Yeah. And that goes to show why religious traditions are necessary, if for nothing else, to give us such word. If we don't have words like the sacred and holy and so on, then you get stuck in words which really can't help you to express the deep experience that you have.
Yeah, so maybe we can address another myth or two, but first, I think we really need to get to the question of how would you define religion? And it's interesting, in your book, you actually don't really do that till at the end, which was cool. It was almost like you were just dissecting. I was like, well, what is religion?
Where are we going here? Yeah. That was quite intentional, obviously, because we really need to deconstruct all the ideas we have before we can then really end up, and okay, we need something else. That's obvious. And the thing that I propose, and I'm certainly not the only one, there's other people out there who also use language, because that's it. I see religion as a language and language as a metaphor. Some other scholars do it as well, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's dominant among academics to use that analogy, but it has stopped being an analogy for me. I've continued to think about it and really, really see it that way. So for me, religion is a language, not a language with words and grammar, but a language with stories, with ideas as well, but with rituals, with ways of life in which you express symbolically, so symbols as well. All those things, we normally associate them with religion, so that's not a problem. But it's a language, so it tries to express certain thing. What does it try to express in that language, which is not words? Well, it tries to express those things that we can't really put in words. And so it's an existential, spiritual, and psychological language to express the stuff that matters to us. Those things that we think are really the essence of life, the depth, why some things are more important than others, and why some things are really, really important. Again, that's why we use words like sacred and holy and so on. Those come in because we're trying to find words in that case. But if we don't have the words, then we make a ritual out of it. Oh, somebody dies. Okay, so we're confronted with that enormous split between life and death. Is it a real split or not? And we can philosophize about it all we want. Does it really stop? Does it not? But in the end, we're stuck with a bunch of emotions when a loved one dies, and we need to do something with it. And we might have some ideas about it, but we need to express it. So we'll create a ritual to do something and to show what we kind of have within ourselves, but for which those words and those philosophies eventually are not enough. And so that for me is religion. It's languages that simply grow all through history, because some people add some other symbols and those people add some rituals, and then some rituals are thrown out and all you want, but it's languages to express the stuff that matters to us very, very deeply. And why is it important to look at it that way? Because in a certain sense, that sounds like what we're used to thinking of when we think of religion, rituals, symbols, and so on. But I think the importance is, if you look at it from the perspective of language, then religion, in its variety and its fuzziness, becomes way more understandable. Just like in language, you have, for example, dialects. You've got dialects in religion as well, dialects between quotes, in the sense that there's so many varieties, and sometimes certain dialects, I mean, in Belgium, for example, probably someone from America doesn't know what Flemish really entails. It sounds like Dutch, and we speak a bit like the Dutch. It's the same language, basically, but somebody from the west of Flanders, if he goes to Amsterdam, and he speaks his dialect, the people from Amsterdam probably won't understand him. But it's about, 150, 200 kilometers, something like that. That's nothing. But the two won't understand each other. And that's a good example for me. That's a dialect in a language. And you've got the same thing in religion. A Zen Buddhist in a Thai Theravada temple won't know what to do. Both are Buddhist nonetheless. It becomes way more understandable. It also becomes understandable how it's possible that religions mix all the time and aren't as delineated as we always think. Why certain rituals from one religion all of a sudden pop up in another. Why ideas are mixed and mingled and so on, all through history. Because that's what languages do. People need more ways of expressing themselves. And so loan words is something that we know in languages. One language uses a word from another language, and give it enough time and people forget that it came from that other language. It just becomes part and parcel of that language. Or also in the life of certain people who simply learn more languages, if nothing else, people who have bilingual parents. One parent speaks one language, the other speaks the other. They both speak it to the kid has both. Well, by now you've got pretty, in the globalized society that we all live in, we've got plenty of people who have bilingual in a religious sense, parents as well, and they get brought up with aspects and variations of both religions that their parents belong to. And so they themselves are, in my view, bilingual. Me, myself, I'm someone like that, or I see myself like that. My mother tongue might be Christianity, but I'm pretty bilingual when it comes to Islam, because I've lived there, because I've so deeply researched it and so on. And because it's a language, it's also not, perhaps is also important for me when it comes to people who are spiritual. And I don't mind what people call cafeteria religion, where you pick and choose a bit from the platter. And okay, that's a cool part of Buddhism. Let's meditate, and I'll take some Shiva statue and put it in my chamber somewhere, and I like the view of it. That's perfectly fine. I really don't have a problem with that. But to really get what traditions are about, you have to study them just like a language. You won't be able to study a religion or a language. Go to Italy, and if you think that in a week, by walking around in Rome, you'll also speak Italian, no, the body believes so. But the strange thing is that we think it about religion. Oh, I went to India, I've been there a month, and now I can say what Hinduism is about. And why do we have the feeling that we can say what Hinduism is about? Because we think that religion can be reduced to a certain set of convictions, to a couple of things that Hindus do. And when you've seen those, then you can tell all about it. And that clearly is not the case. If you really want to get into Hinduism, you'll have to study just as long as you would if you wanted to study Italian and be fluent in speaking it. Some couple of loan words, of course, that's not a problem. But really getting it, that's a different ballpark altogether. But it's possible. And that's the other aspect of it. Is it possible to be multilingual in a religious sense? Obviously. Why not? History is full of such people. And yeah, like I said, I do consider myself to be one of them.
Yeah, I never heard of anybody define religion as a language. And I think I've couldn't find it, but I found actually a whole list of people defining religions in different ways. And one that I really loved was the German-American theologian, Paul Tillich. He said, to be religious is to have an ultimate concern. And I just love that thing. And then to me, it just seems like that's just so embedded. Like, how can you not, like, you could be oblivious to it, right? Like, you could live your life for some part of your life, you could be disconnected from that until things really get real, until you're dealing with some kind of existential crisis. And then you have ultimate concern. But for some of us, it's almost like we can't help it. It's like we stay embedded in that, whether it's through meditation, prayer, or just being very much connected, living with that ultimate concern every day. And for much of the day, we're connected to that.
Absolutely. The only thing is that when we use definitions like that for religion, like the ultimate concern, I do agree, obviously. Like I said, religion is the language that talks about the stuff that matters. But because it's a language, and that's also one of the things that I find important in using language more as a metaphor, or even more than a metaphor, is that if you say it's about ultimate concern, then people who are dealing with religion somehow have to be focused on that ultimate concern, and that is not always the case. That's why I think language is useful. It might have arisen around ultimate concerns of lots of people, but it becomes a language, just the way you talk. And so people are just using that language half of the time. They do the rituals, they go to the temples, whatever, but they're not really thinking about their ultimate concern half of the time, but they're still doing the religious stuff. So I'd be simply a little bit wary of using such a definition, because that immediately brings in the dichotomy of those who are doing religious properly and the ones who are not doing it properly. And I back off of that one a bit, because sometimes, well, no, it doesn't matter to me how proper you do it. Who would I be to say whether it would be proper or not? But I see people using the language. And yes, they invoke I'll give a silly example, but it makes it clear. When Muslims say goodbye and somebody says, I hope to see you again next week, they'll say, Inshallah, if God wills. Is that person really thinking, oh, if only fate and God is so graceful that he allows me to meet you next week? No, of course not. He's simply saying, Inshallah, and it means as much as, yeah, see you again. That's about what it means at that particular moment. But he's used a symbol of his particular tradition without really attaching much meaning at that specific moment. But the cool thing about the symbol is that the moment he really needs it, he can use it. The moment it's somebody who he might perhaps not see anymore, and it's a really tensionful goodbye, then the inshallah is exactly the same word, and it gets the resonance that it always has had, but not always was used as, but at that moment it is used the way it was supposed to be used. But it doesn't mean that using it in a more colloquial sense was wrong or something, or not really religious. Yes, it was really religious at that moment. And that's for me the beauty about the idea of seeing religion as a language, because it opens up the possibility of allowing religion to be in its most daily, mundane ways, the way it is, and also allowing it to be its highest spiritual self it can be.
I think one of the other things I wanted to comment on that you said about like the cafeteria version, like, the a la carte, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And I think this is a really important point. And it's something I'm running across for myself. I happen to be mostly into Buddhism, and those are the traditions that I study. And it's interesting what I've recently come across information basically saying that there's like three vehicles. There's three vehicles. They're called vehicles because they're paths. They're vehicles to get you to somewhere, right? And there's different vehicles in Buddhism where there's Hayana, which is like Theravada, there's Mahayana, and there's Tantrayana, and there's like these different ways of moving to this goal of like enlightenment. But the thing is, they're different paths, right? They might be leading you to the same place, but there are different ways of getting there, and those different ways are useful for certain people living in a certain way. And if you actually take a little bit of here, a little bit there, they end up contradicting themselves because they're different ways of getting up the mountain. So it's like we're all going up the same mountain, but we're taking different ways, but we need different maps because I'm maybe going on one side and you're going on the other. And if I'm trying to I'm reading this map and that map, I end up getting nowhere. So that's something that I feel like I've been, because I am somebody who likes to dabble in a lot of stuff. And I'm like, I'm going to read this and read that and read this, and not realizing like, oh, actually, this is one yana and this is another yana, and this is one map and this is a different map. And I'm just entangling all of this together, and it's actually confusing me. So there is something maybe to sticking to, maybe they all have truths and they can all get us up the mountain, but it's like, choose your map, choose your path, and follow it.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that is often overlooked, that there is usefulness in tradition and sometimes sticking to a particular path. And you might even become multilingual or bilingual. That's all possible. But if you do, then try to go as deep as you can. Because, yeah, exactly what you said, there's various paths, but sometimes it might get confusing if you start mixing up too many languages. Then the stuff that you're going to say is going to sound gibberish to people, and it's also not going to help you to communicate. And so sometimes you need to get into a tradition. And partly why we need to stick to a tradition is also not to let our ego take the upper hand. Certainly in a Buddhist sense, that's always the tricky part there. And the thing we try to get ourselves out of is that whole ego mentality and the ego itself. And so cafeteria religion, I don't have a problem with it in a sociological sense, of course. Go ahead, do what you want. But in a spiritual sense, I'll definitely be saying stuff in the line of what you have just been saying. And that's because sometimes in a tradition, we bump against stuff that really doesn't sit too well. And that at first might be very difficult to digest. But sometimes you have to stick with it. The problem with cafeteria religion can be that, oh, it's too difficult for me. I'll leave this behind and I'll just go to the next thing. And that's what I mean with the ego. Then it's just your ego searching for the next big experience. Oh, and here the mystical stuff has withered away. Oh, but there's ayahuasca there. Let me go there and find some happiness and blissfulness there. All possible to fill your life with such spiritual and mystical experiences all the time from various corners of the world. But does it really get you deeper? Does it get you out of your ego? Does it get you closer to God? Does it get you closer to the enlightenment, whatever you're looking for? So yeah, I'd agree. Sometimes you need to stick with the master or the teachings that you've chosen and really digest them. And only after maybe even years, sometimes if you're lucky after a couple of days or weeks, but sometimes years, then all of a sudden it hits you, oh, that's what they were talking about. Oh yeah, now I see that, right. That's the absolute balance of what my soul needed. And sometimes you have to let that balance do its work itself on you and not just think that you are the one who can immediately know what is right and wrong, and then just jump to whatever is easiest and most convenient. That, in a spiritual sense, I don't believe in. Yeah. But on one other thing that I wanted to mention when you brought up the different parts, it's quite a common metaphor also in Hindu contexts and so on, and certainly also in general spirituality or contemporary spirituality, that it's a mountain and we're all walking on a path, but we try to reach the top. That, of course, remains a hypothesis. I do believe it myself. I'm somebody who places myself within that tradition of thinking, and that's where my difference with my sociological view of religion and my personal spiritual view comes into play a bit. From a sociological perspective, I'd have to say that's a hypothesis. Is it really so that all religions are leading to the same top there? Because that would mean that we have to kind of combine atheism and theism itself. I think it's feasible in my own theology, but it's not necessarily a given that we're all walking in the same direction. And that's also why I like the metaphor of language. We're talking about stuff that matters. But whether the stuff we're talking about is exactly the same, well, they'll need a lot of communication and a lot of translation work as well. And it's just that for me, there's a bit of a danger in co-opting the other religions in our own view by saying, oh, we're just all pots to the same thing. Then we've basically said the thing that I'm trying to get at. That's probably also the thing you're getting at, isn't it? But maybe it isn't. And that we have to talk about.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the humility around that, and that, it feels like that's kind of the thread you've been riding through in the book of like, there's language, we can't get away from language, and it's this language is kind of speaking about something ineffable, and we have different ways of talking about it, and we don't really know what we're talking about, and it's like we think we have the same understanding, but we could have radically different understandings. And the only way we can know is by agreeing what a word means. I agree on this word, you agree, and we try to get our terms right. But there's always misunderstandings in even communicating about things that are kind of more concrete and objective and simple than, religious concerns, things that are God, right? God, love, truth, these kind of transcendental concepts that it's hard to find common ground on. And so perhaps we can touch maybe on one last myth. And there's actually, this is kind of, because I didn't want to talk about the science and religion one, but perhaps this is very much related, as I think myth number 7 is kind of like, the encapsulating myth. And it's basically a secular society is completely different and inherently better than a religious society. So, and, I kind of started with this at the beginning, talking about growing up in a religious, in a secular home and not being religious. So maybe you could kind of speak to this dichotomy between secular and religious, and also maybe scientific and religious, because there seems to be that
together.
Yeah.
Those two belong together, definitely. Yeah, well, it's the crux of the matter. In the end, the way we look at religion is completely construed on the idea of secularism, and perhaps not to delve too deep into it because it could take us way too far and too long. But it's important for people to know that religion hasn't always been there as a word in history. And it certainly hasn't always been there in other cultures, almost not. Not until colonialism, where they needed a translation of the word. But even in the Middle Ages, maybe that's a good example. Even in the Middle Ages, in the Latin version of the Bible, there only was 4 times mention of religion. And the way the word was used, religio, really didn't mean this bundle of convictions of a large group of people. That wasn't it. It was more about kind of church forums or something like that in obscure passages that really didn't matter that much. That says a lot. That the word religion and the concept, the way we use it today, wasn't really a staple of normal conversation in the Middle Ages. And that might already raise an eyebrow for some people. So when does it become a word that is generally used? That's in the time when two things happen, basically. The Protestants arise and the nation states start to form. And those two are intricately related to each other, but I won't delve too deep into the history. But what happens there is that Protestant Christianity uses the word religio, which had a couple of connotations, but it starts using it in a bit of a different way as the focus on God and as the most important aspect of religion itself, of Christianity itself. The fact that in yourself you have the correct faith, focused on the right God. That is what Protestant theology does. It makes it an inner thing of convictions. That's when the word religion originates. And why is it important that nation states arise at the same time? Because, of course, for the powers in those or the powers that be in those days, that was humongously convenient to finally have an idea that what your private convictions are of the world and the universe and humans and what they ought to be, that's something in your brain. But what you do outside in the public square, that's up to the state to decide. So what we see in the 15th, 16th century is basically a privatization of religion. And basically also the origination of religion as a concept immediately opposed to the secular society. That's to say, the world, the secular, is ruled by the monarch or the emperor or whomever it was, but the state itself becomes the embodiment of the proper powers of the public. Religion is supposedly something that you could only live in the privacy of your own mind. So that's where the concept originates. But that still makes it a private conviction of God and basically of Jesus as the Son of God in the Protestant theology of those days. That doesn't still mean that there's the religions as we know them all over the world. That takes another power dynamic, and that's colonialism. When the colonial powers spread out over all the world, they start to, in the scientific mindset of the day, growing is the idea that we could describe the whole world in scientific and nothing but rational terms. That's also an idea that originated in the 18th, 19th century. And so that kind of scientism goes together with colonialism. They encounter different cultures and they start mapping them out. They make a scientific effort of trying to categorize. And that's where we started our conversation with. A categorization is all over the place. We start categorizing everybody into religions. So, but important there is that, of course, that original idea of religion is something private and the state is what determines the public square obviously gets taken along. So once they start categorizing the world in Hindus and Buddhists and Jains and Taoists and so on, and Christians, that immediately entails, yeah, but if it's your religion, please keep it private because we, the colonial power, we're obviously the ones who are in charge of the secular space. So whatever you think it in your bedroom, think it in your home, but don't take it out in public and certainly not into the politics because the politics we will decide. And so there you've got this us versus them completely creating itself in two important power dynamics of the last couple of centuries and creating this whole idea of the secular versus the religious. And you can immediately see how that dichotomy is part and parcel of a certain power dynamics that leads us up to today, or that still strings along until today. And so, yeah, that quite logically, the idea then becomes that the secular way of organizing a life obviously is better than the religious idea. But why would it actually? Because that idea itself, in itself, is part of a frame of thinking about the world. And right at the beginning, when we talked about categorizations, I said, well, you can't be neutral in such things. And that idea itself is not neutral either. And that's the whole point. Itself, the idea of the split between religion and secularism is, in fact, in my eyes, a kind of religious idea. It's almost a dogma. In the sense of it's so ingrained in people's minds that they almost can't think outside of it, or can't almost not imagine what a world would be if you don't categorize the world in that way. But once you try to, then the obvious next step is to simply see such a frame of thinking for what it is, a story about the world, and you could tell lots of other stories, but we've decided in the centuries that lie behind us, we've decided to tell this particular stories of religions there and secularism here and so on. And so we get stuck in this dichotomy that really doesn't help us. And again, it blinds us on a couple of sides. On the one side, it acts as if all religion is by definition dogmatic. We've had that one already. And on the other side, it completely blinds people who think they're nothing but secular from all the religious stuff they're doing. Nationalism, I already mentioned, is often a heavily religious thing, with a flag that you rally around that's a symbol, with rituals of national days and national anthems and all you want. The same thing for economy. It's full of ritualistic behavior. Let's say I'm thinking about something in my own country, but the equivalent in the US would be Black Friday or something. Well, yeah, that's a ritual for the, let's say, the feast of capitalism or something. Every year again, everybody is completely focused on that. If you'd have millions of people going to the same street in India, you would think it's a Kumbh Mela. If you that in the US because it's Black Friday, then it's just, oh yeah, what society does, but that's not religious. Why wouldn't it be? You really think that the next piece of electronics will create a happier life for you? So it's even a moral thing what you're doing there on Black Friday. So in that sense, most stuff that we see around us is religious, and it cannot be anything else. If, like I said, religion is a language of what matters to us, then you cannot live outside of that language as long as you're human, as long as you're communicating with others. We live in stories. A purely factual world doesn't make any sense. Oh, this is blue, this is green, that is a sound, here is a brick wall. That doesn't mean anything. You create your life in a certain story. Why is it important that the wall is there? Do I want to be on the other side? Why or not do I want to be on the other side? The blueness, is it beautiful to me? Why is it beautiful? And is it more beautiful than another type of blue or not? And so all those kinds of ways of dealing with the world are necessarily ingrained in a story. Which brings us to science, of course. It's the correlation with the secular world, the idea that a secular society is built on nothing but facts and on nothing but scientific research. That, A, obviously isn't true once you delve into it. And B, it's simply part of that story. And it's part of, frankly, a colonial racist story. We're the rationally enlightened, factual ones. All the others who are still religious, oh, they're still a bit behind, and they have to learn to be as factual and scientific as we are. And so that's the same dichotomy, basically. But it ends up in the same thing. But all science is eventually also part of a bigger story. Why do we research this particular aspect of society and not this aspect? Why all the research on materialist, technological stuff? Why is that dominantly what we research? Well, because it happens to do well within a society that has this materialist view of the world to start with, which happens to be the thing that capitalists, of course, also like, because that's basically what the system that enriches them is built upon. But something completely else would be if we start researching the things that many religions have been talking about. What if reality is made of other stuff? What if it is made of spiritual stuff? And what if we really start researching that and what it does with our own spiritual mindset? What does that entail? Luckily, those things are coming little by little in society, but it's just an example I give of the stuff you focus on in your scientific research is not a fact in itself. It's chosen by policymakers and by scientists themselves within a bigger frame, within a bigger story about the world itself. So those people who think that we live in nothing but a secular scientific world, I'm afraid they're just as religious as anybody else.
Yeah, that was a very like exhaustive example of just like I would actually love to hear somebody argue against that, because there is just so much there that would be, at least from my standpoint, it's hard to argue against. And I really like the example of Black Friday being like a ritual of capitalism, which is also a religion, and nationalism and liberalism and secularism and scientism, and these are all just religions. They're all kind of languages. They're all kind of ways of looking, and we can't help but have a way of looking or orientation. We're embedded in that, right? And that's, it seems like that's how you're thinking about religion. That's we can't escape that. We can't.
We can't escape it, and we don't have to. It's a fun game to play. Let's say. Yeah. Sometimes I also use the metaphor that secularism acts as if it's the referee of the football game, and there you've got the religions and they're playing on this field, and now go ahead, don't be too violent against each other, and let's see who scores the most points. But that's disingenuous. Secularism is just one of the players on the field, and it's playing the game along with us. So let's create a level playing field and just start having that conversation, because it's an interesting conversation and we can't get out of the conversation to start with. So let's have some fun while doing it, I would think.
There's a thinker I like, Charles Eisenstein, and he says reality is a conversation, and they just kind of points to it like we're having a conversation, and this is what reality is, and it's just having that conversation. And I think so. This is kind of one last thing that I really kind of want to say, which I think a lot of your work and what you're saying is pointing to, and seeing a lot of other people kind of saying similar things. I recently spoke to Tom Cheatham, and he's somebody who studied James Hillman and Henry Corbin. And he, one of the fundamental ideas of James Hillman, who's a Jungian psychologist, he basically said is this central kind of pathology that people fall into is literalism. It's like taking things literally. And it seems like most of the issues people have with religion are not with religion, but with fundamentalist interpretations of religious texts. So the real issue is fundamentalism or literalism. And it's this kind of black or white way of looking, black or white way of categorizing. And it seems like what you're really doing with your work is kind of deliteralizing, is seeing through this literalism and helping us get into this more of this complex gray, flavor that reality is. It's not this black or white, and that's the issue that's here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I actually watched that episode because, as it happens, my own, let's say, spiritual mentor, don't know how to call it any other way, is a Pakistani to start with. And she's she's a psychologist as well. And she's very Hillman influenced. And so I've read Hillman stuff as well, and I'm quite into it. And so, she also got me into contact about that, thinking of Hillman and Corbin and so on literalism and imagination and so on. And so I'm heavily influenced myself by those same Jungian ideas, definitely. And so I would fully agree. Yeah, it's part of what I'm trying to do as well, like many others are doing. And exactly like you frame it, what people are fighting against, sometimes I really can agree what they're fighting against. They just have to realize that it's not religion itself that they think they are fighting. They're having a problem with a fundamentalist, literalist way of approaching the world. And I couldn't agree less. That is a problem. Everything in life is spectra, is polar opposites, and we're somewhere in between. But the pure pole mostly doesn't exist, because it is this fluid dynamic of all relationships being entangled with each other and creating this field of various spectra all through each other intermingling. That to me is reality itself. And so, yeah, a literalist approach is kind of deconnecting yourself of the true reality or something like that. And I agree, it's that literalist mindset that creates also simply the violence. So again, yeah, no, it's not religion which is violent, but it's creating this mindset where it's either this way or it's the highway, but in a really bad manner. What I write in my book, it's not the belief in God which is the problem, but thinking you're God. And that's what I meant by it. If you think you're God, you think you can decide for each and every one of us what is good and what is bad, and what is the proper way of living and what is the wrong way of living. That's actually usurping the position of God, because he's the, or she is the only being that is capable of truly holding good and bad together in their fullnesses. That, by the way, that's the beauty of the story of Genesis. Most people don't see it, but why do we get thrown out of paradise? Because we urgently think we need to eat of that tree of good and evil. What's so bad about all of the sudden seeing what good and evil is? Well, because we try to usurp the place of God, then we're going to decide being slim is good, being fat is bad. Who on earth decided that? Well, that's what our society gets stuck in. It's just one example of the thousands that can be given once we start deciding those kind of things, what we think is ugly and what is pretty, and what is pretty is good and what is ugly is bad. That kind of dichotomy, that of kind of dualism, that indeed creates lots of problems for everyone. And so, yeah, literalism is indeed a big part of the problem. But to come back to the previous point of secularism and so on, that's exactly why it's not religion which is the problem, but literalism. That's also why secular ideas can become just as problematic and violent. Yes, there have been wars waged for democracy. It's the same thing. If you think that you know all there is to know about democracy and you'll bring it to the others and you start bombing them into freedom, well, probably you're doing the opposite of what you're pretending to do. But yes, wars, because of such a beautiful concept like democracy, have just as well been waged. And it's the same thing for nationalism. There is beauty in feeling connected to a people. There's beauty there. But once that people or that particular group of people who starts thinking that it's the people of the world, and then it starts killing the others, and where we don't want to be. But it's the same thing. It's a literalist assumption of being the right people. It's a literalist assumption of my democracy is the only right type of democracy, and there can't be any other. So yeah, and you see that same literalist mindset within secular societies, and sometimes even perhaps even more, because in lots of ways that brings us back to this imagined idea of secularism and science are the same thing. Yeah, well, what kind of science? And mostly people mean materialist science. And if you look at philosophical materialism, everything in the world is nothing but stuff, things. What kind of a literalist mindset is that reduces our whole being to stuff, to atoms, to molecules? Even love becomes something like pheromones that goes against every fiber of my body and the whole of my experience of what love really is, by reducing it to nothing but matter. That's a hugely literalist assumption that eventually, when you think it through, gave us the complete destruction and exploitation of the world. Because the world is nothing but resources, but matter. We can use that matter the way we want it because we're nothing but matter as well. Maybe if we had a bit of a more spiritual view of the world, we wouldn't hurt Mother Earth the way we are doing.
Yeah, there's a lot that I could say on my website. I have a whole page of seeing through materialism, and it's like a bunch of books that are addressing this materialistic view, which I don't even like to call people materialists, because I believe that there's strains of thinking and looking, materialistic strains that we all have. Like, I know I have them, and they're just hard to see through. It's like we're embedded in that.
Yeah.
The one thing I did want to say is I think there's nothing wrong with thinking of yourself as God, as long as you remember that everybody else is God.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In the non-dualist sense, absolutely. We're all divine. Yeah, mostly to create that distinction, I don't say I'm God, I am divine. We are all divine because everything in existence is eventually part of the divinity. But that doesn't mean that I'm God itself. I'm natural in every cell of my body, but that doesn't mean I'm nature itself, obviously. But yeah, we definitely agree there.
Yeah. So, I really appreciate that. I'm really happy that I ran across your work, and I really appreciate your sincerity to studying religion. And, years ago, I never would have imagined myself diving so deeply into religion and becoming so much more acquainted. And I've been reading a lot and studying a lot about it. I've read Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, which is fascinating, really helped me understand kind of the psychology and behind religion and mythology. And just been kind of slowly getting more and more into it and just understanding it. And your work is very exhaustive in this topic of like breaking down these myths and these mistaken beliefs that people have about religion. And, it also seems like you very much are committed to this kind of helping people get out of this black or white thinking and this polarization, and meeting in this gray area, and just being in dialogue and being in conversation. And I really appreciate that, and appreciate this conversation. And I just want to say, is there anything you wish I would have asked you, or anything else you want to share before we close up?
That's a good question. Not particularly. Thanks for the kind words. No. I'm happy you're walking the path that you're walking. It's beautiful to see. So no, last word. Just something from me to you. I also checked out your music. I liked it a lot. Spiritual hip hop. There's too little of it, I believe.
Yes. It's been taking a back seat of my life with.
Yeah,
I have a lot of stuff going on, but I do hope that I can get back to writing and recording more in the future.
Yeah,
so I appreciate you checking it out.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yes. Jonas, thanks a lot for coming on. Appreciate you. All
Thank
the best.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.